You're a little bit like a diplomatic Rob Hersoff. He says things similar, but in a different way. And thanks for putting the sensible approach. And perhaps you could just elaborate a little bit more about cadre deployment. I know you call it cadre deployment, but in South Africa it's like it's violence and it's cadre deployment. We've got our own terms for some of these, or pronunciation of some of these terms. Just how it works, because there's a lot of people here who haven't read the papers the DA forced out of the ANC government on how cadre deployment worked and has worked, and maybe some ideas about can that be unwound and how.
Yeah, so in terms of the institutional landscape in South Africa, I think it lends itself very much to cadre deployment.
Let's hold on a second. Can everybody hear David? Do you want to bring the mic closer?
Yeah. Okay, there you go. So the fact that we have so many state-owned enterprises in South Africa means that there are many more opportunities for capture. There are board positions that need to be filled, executive positions. But again, going back to the institutional framework, the Judicial Services Commission, which I mentioned, which elects judges, on its face, that seems like pretty sensible constitutional body that brings justices before a panel for review, and various stakeholders review the candidacy of the prospective judge. But that process has been politicized, and that is seen as an area to be captured. And so there's been a very intentional attempt to get the right people in those committees. So, yeah, I mean, look, it is part of the political process. Political parties do have their preferred people, and they want to deploy them. But I think the fact that we have so many areas in which the government is actively interfering in the economy and controls so much, I think raises the stakes.
I'm going to go back to the papers that the DA took 3 years to get out. And essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, there's a little group of people that look truly house who decide on every senior appointment in government, in the state enterprise, 1/3 of the economy, and also business. Now, you mentioned that. You spoke about business or government, or the ANC's guy is in your boardroom. Just unpack that a little bit for us, because I can get that they will put political lackeys or cadres into positions. We've seen the CEO of Eskom, for instance, and a long way down the list as well. But how do they get them into boardrooms? How does the government's man sit in a boardroom and give us this really warped approach that big business has been playing up to this point?
Well, I've seen Moeletsi Mbeki speaking on your channel several times, and he's always excellent. And what I think Moeletzi's point there is that BE was in some senses a brainchild of big established Afrikaner capital during the transition as well, as a way of an attempt to co-opt the newly incumbent government. But I would argue that was perhaps a short-sighted approach. If you look at the career of Mr. Ramaphosa, for example, he has spent, before he became president or before he became deputy president, has navigated his way through multiple listed corporate entities in South Africa and used that as a way to accumulate capital. He's not an entrepreneur. He's somebody who's benefited from equity transfers. So in many senses, that has directly and indirectly provided resources and patronage for the political class in South Africa. So when there are calls to move away from BE, the first person to defend it is Mr. Ramaphosa himself.
But going a little bit deeper, is that a bit of a Trojan horse within the business community?
Yeah, I would say so, because it's packaged as a gift, but its contents is perhaps a bit more sinister. And I think it's maybe also a bit more subtle. It serves as a way of reinforcing a certain set of dominant ideas, like this notion of transformation. There's not a single mention of the word transformation in South Africa's constitution, and yet it's often bandied about as this national imperative. We must have transformation. What does that even mean? It's really a code word for a very specific political agenda that the ANC represents. So when you have people on your board, it sort of normalizes a lot of these ideas. And I would say businesses should very jealously guard their independence. You can still try to understand and navigate within this complex environment, but inviting the political class into your boardroom does come with some downside risks. And a lot of it is through BE imperatives that, you need to check a box. But the effect is, I think, quite insidious.
Those BE imperatives, are you aware of companies being told who to do the BEE transactions with?
Well, according to Leon Schreiber of the DA and the minutes from those cadre deployment meetings, there were specific instructions for which individuals should be placed in which positions. I don't know if that's necessarily private sector as well, but certainly in the state-owned enterprises.
It's not a very far leap to go from there to see how big business has either been duped or it's been compliant in this whole process of the disaster that we're sitting at right now. If you think about the election of Cyril himself, now maybe Rob's got it wrong, but Rob said that there were some pretty senior business people who put together R1 billion to make sure that Cyril would be elected. And Rob, being Jewish, said they were mostly Jewish. And what are they feeling now that Cyril is a big supporter of Hamas, for instance? So might there be a change in that, from you've been saying, come on, business, get some, grow a pair. I think you've said it very diplomatically. Are you seeing any feedback from that first speech of yours? And might there be a change in big businesses' attitude come the election and thereafter?
Look, I think some of those high net worth individuals who supported Mr. Ramaphosa's campaign in 2017 for the ANC presidency, my understanding is that their calls are not answered by the president anymore. And perhaps that realization is now starting to land, that the access that they thought they once had was maybe not really there to begin with. So I think hopefully that represents a change in mindset. And I would encourage those wealthy individuals to rather support the thriving civil society groups that exist in South Africa and start building those alternatives to the government, rather than trying to lobby for reform within the ANC. There are no reformers within the ANC as far as I can see. Again, this point of the National Democratic Revolution, it is an ideological meme, if you will, that filters through the whole organization. So you can't really expect waves of free market reforms from this government. The instances where it has happened, for example, in energy generation, that was a reform that was thrust upon the government unwillingly. And that was a reflex. It was a concession to reality. So that's, I think, the best you can hope for with this government in terms of reform.
Are you seeing more of that happening, given, for instance, with Transnet, the disaster that was there? We saw that Melanie Vaness and, she's got a big pair, stood up against government, said get rid of the CEO of Transnet, and they duly did. So there seems to be someone somewhere listening to business.
Yeah, and I think what Melanie did there, I think, was a good example of understanding the bargaining power. To say, I represent a specific constituency. We see a lot of seminars in business schools or posts on LinkedIn where people talk about business's leadership role. But your role as a business leader is to represent your constituents, to represent your shareholders, your employers, your board. You have a duty and responsibility to represent their interests, not the government's interests. So I think having a more robust approach, and Anthea can explain this, part of the NDR philosophy is also about the balance of forces, that a socialist policy program will be advanced until it meets with resistance. But if there's no resistance, that policy gets driven through. And we're very concerned about the passage of the NHI bill. But that's a good example of that. That bill has taken 11 years, and through countless amounts of challenges, the legal challenges are waiting. So throwing sand in the gears of something like that, I think, is very important, and that's how the balance of forces can be won in your favor.
Something that Rob mentioned and you repeated a little bit is don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness. Seems to be a pretty common tactic among smaller businesses. We see that all over the place, but in big business that hasn't really been applied. Are you advocating a move in that direction?
Yeah, so the government relies upon legitimacy and authority to enforce its edicts. So if you can find a way of taking that away, then you can deprive the government of its power. So France earlier mentioned the development of these enclaves, and I think that is a very effective way of dealing with many of the problems associated with state failure in South Africa, whether it's providing water and electricity within these communities. I think that's very effective. But then in response, you see the government saying, well, no, hang on, we need the states to comply with BEE in terms of their procurement practices. So now there's a choice. Do you comply with that as a managing entity of an estate like that? Because then you're back in the slipstream of the government and its way of doing things. So what I'm saying is this is a power game. There's the legal mechanisms, and there are many lawyers who will line up, and many of them are advising the Western Cape government saying, no, you can't do this. This is not a prescribed power for the province. But, the law can also follow the reality. As we saw, there was a political contest in the late 1980s and the early 1990s that resulted in a paradigm shift in the country's politics. The Constitution was born out of that process. It was the consequence of a political pact. It didn't just come down from Mount Sinai. So that is what I'm suggesting, is you can recognize that there is a contest for power happening. The ANC government is losing its authority, and fine, there's an electoral process in a month or so that's going to really be highly deterministic of the country's future. But there are other pillars, other spheres of contestation that can also be fought.
I remember talking to Jordan Hilders a couple of years ago when he was elected, 2021, before he was elected mayor, and he said, I'm going to kick the door down that had been opened as squeak by Gwede Mantashe. It's hard to believe, but it was only that year, 2021, that we were allowed for the first time in the private sector to produce power, despite the insanity of the situation. And he's kicked that door down as aggressively as he can. If you were advising him today, what other doors should he be kicking down?
See, well, I think transport is one. I mentioned crime. I mean, I think the philosophy of a DA-led government should be, how do I represent my constituents in the same way that we're talking about business? And, if your child is being gunned down on the weekend in Mitchell's Plain, you don't really care about provincial versus national competencies in the Constitution. You care about the welfare and safety of your child. So, yeah, the DA government can point a finger at Pretoria and say, well, it's not our fault. These guys are woefully corrupt and incompetent. But I would say that the people of the Western Cape are going to have limited patience for that. So, and I think the DA does enjoy a lot of legitimacy and authority, but there are also many areas where governance can be improved in the Western Cape, and which would benefit them politically to do so. So acquiring some of those powers, I would highly recommend. Transport is, I think, a domain where they could succeed. I don't necessarily have a roadmap for how to do that, but I think acquiring as many powers as you can and making that your challenge. How can you, if the state has left a vacancy, if the national government has left a vacancy because through sheer incapacity or an unwillingness to govern, then you can fill that void.
We've heard also many times being mentioned that maybe the DA is a little complacent in the Western Cape. Maybe it's going to get a wake-up call at the next election, but maybe it could be more aggressive. Those have been the suggestions that have come through here. What is it going to take for those who are doing a damn good job relative to the rest of the country in governing this province to actually push that envelope a little more?
Yeah, so I mentioned in my speech that you should embrace this idea of bottom-up federalism. And I very much enjoyed John Steenhuisen's speech. I thought his assessment of things was very sound. But, he said we need changes in national legislation to affect more provincial powers. I think it's the Provincial Powers Bill or the Referendum Bill. So, that's fine if you can affect that. But if you don't have the numbers at the National Assembly to do that, then that's not really going to happen. So I think flipping it around and saying, well, let's work from the bottom up and trying to acquire as many powers as possible through that route, I think is more effective.
Okay, so we're getting close to the time that we're opening to the floor, but the way I'm understanding this now is that we're going into an election, and what we've heard is it's likely that the socialists are going to win again. Maybe not the ANC on its own, but with MK and EFF, and maybe the Kremlin will knock their heads together and say, guys, we don't want to lose this country. That could happen. Let's just use that as a scenario. What then should the other side, the good guys, as Corny Mulder said, how can they change their approach? What I'm hearing from you is just get out there and damn well do it. Stop pussyfooting around this. Push the envelope, and in fact, kick those doors down, as Jordan Hill Lewis suggested. Am I reading it right?
Yeah, I think so. I think if that scenario materializes, I think there's going to be a serious coming down from that, because the expectations were so high. And as Bill Johnson mentioned earlier, the unfortunate fact is that if you look at the fragmentation that's happened within the ANC, the aggregate number over time hasn't really come down. So that is a real risk that, you might have three different versions of African nationalist socialism, but the overall tally is the same. So, look, I mean, I'm very glad that I'm not a politician, because I don't have to make these difficult trade-offs and decisions. But I think there will be a sense in which the current trajectory, is really unsustainable. And how do you then go about preserving order, protecting value and assets and incomes and existing wealth in South Africa, mitigating against some of those national state failures? I've spoken about some of the strategies that you can do on an individual level, but I think the scaling up, that's the real challenge. But I think the preconditions are there. I think the ground is there. It's fertile.
State-proof yourself. Okay, let's open to the floor. Here's a question.
Okay, I just want to trying to work out what is the Free Market Foundation's got incredible record of handing over title to lesser disadvantaged people. you look at the predecessor, Leon Loeb was your predecessor. I think it's managed to get donors and work with municipalities and actually hand over title. Has this changed in the Free Market Foundation? Because I'm just trying to understand, is the changes always in terms of that as your goal as an organization, or is the environment perhaps, or the political environment not good enough? So the question is, has the Free Market Foundation actually changed its spots?
No, we're very much the same animal. Very glad that you raised the Kai Lam project, which is the title deed project. That's something that is very close to our hearts. It was established in 2010 by a variety of people, one of whom was Perry Feldman, the now Perry Feldman, who was a farmer in the Free State. And he really recognized the importance of extending private property rights to Black South Africans who had lived in council-owned properties for sometimes generations. But after the transition, after the passage of the Ultra Act, where in 1991 the de Klerk government essentially divested itself of these council properties and gave the properties to the existing tenants. That was great, but there was no title deed to prove your ownership status. So the Kai Lam project, we work with conveyancers, councils, and the donors who very generously sponsor the project to transfer those title deeds to the rightful owners. And that's a project that has grown from strength to strength. I'm very proud to say that we recently transferred our 12,000th title deed. And about 6,000 of those, about half, have been in the last couple of years. So the project's really ramping up, and we're very proud of it. And there are many people who made that project possible. But I think what's great about a project like that is, yes, we're a policy think tank. We operate in the realm of ideas, but this is a very practical manifestation of the benefits of private property rights. It's not just wealthy people who benefit from private property. We believe that ownership is a right that all people should have. And it's not just about the economic benefits, which are many. It's also about the dignity that you afford the people who benefit from private property rights.
Yeah.
Private property rights are a human right.
I think when you talk, just bring the mic a bit closer, like you're singing in a rock, style. So, how many of those title deeds have you handed over in total?
Over 12,000.
Over 12,000.
Yeah.
David, thanks for the talk. Intentional communities, and I referred to Kings Heights in Grahamstown, Waterfall Estate, even Orania in the Northern Cape, 3,000 permanent residents. What is your view as regards an intentional community movement being in between what we have at the moment and full sort of independence and self-determination on the scale that you might want for us?
Yeah, so if I understand the question correctly, it's around voluntary communities. I think the voluntariness is a very important thing. Wouldn't want that to be enforced. So I'm not quite sure I understand your question precisely.
Okay, so the way I understand it is more Oranias, but not necessarily as isolated as they are. That communities get together more and have their own, look after their own communities. Is that part of this whole? If the government is not going to help you, go and help yourself.
Yeah, so I think that goes back to the scalability issue. So, if you were to experience what many people in Johannesburg have experienced over the last few weeks, which is no water coming out of their taps for days at a time. I mean, one of the options is you could get a JoJo tank, or you could sink a borehole in your backyard. That's a very expensive, capital-intensive exercise. Whereas if you could get a community of like-minded people together who are willing to pool resources and share expertise, then you can start to develop that scale from the ground up. I mean, whether it's in Orania or a Steyn City or one of the Gulf estates in George, I think these are the templates, the beginnings of these kind of new decentralized types of communities, which I think is something that we should support and embrace.
Sounds very Ayn Randy.
Well, yeah.
Goes all the entrepreneurs go and make their own little operation far away from the government that was oppressing them.
Yeah, I'm actually reading The Fountainhead at the moment, and I think what's interesting about the Randian philosophy is sort of this, like, you're a very strong, all-powerful individual, and definitely those disruptive entrepreneurs, those visionaries are the ones that really spark creativity and innovation and so on. But I think what's maybe missing there is this idea that we can voluntarily collaborate with others to really achieve big things, So, but again, emphasis on the voluntariness of those private relationships. So, market-based economics generates opportunity, prosperity for everyone. And like Davy Root, the economist and a FMF board member, often says, free trade is like a free lunch. It benefits both parties, not just the buyer or the seller. So I think one of the consequences of the diminishing capacity of the state is that we're always seeing the emergence of like a libertarian minimal state in South Africa. I mean, during the COVID pandemic, if you were in South Africa, okay, there were definitely some quite egregious abuses of power. Somebody was killed in his backyard for drinking beer. But if you look at the governments of Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, Canada, they were all very ruthlessly efficient at enforcing those lockdown rules and regulations. So if you would in Australia and you posted on Facebook that you don't like the lockdown, then 8 o'clock the next morning, the police are knocking on your door and taking you away. So in some ways, there's a kind of a freedom to the situation in South Africa, which you don't get in other countries. That comes with some other negative externalities, like somebody might shoot you on your way home from work. But it's definitely the Wild West out here, but that's the way it is.
Johnny Rabi, who's a property developer in Cape Town, when we lived in Johannesburg, always used to say to me, "How's it going in Texas?" I said, "Well, Texas? Is that the Wild West?" Now it really has been. Graham, you're back.
Thank you. The elephant in the room are the elections, and of course what you're raising are all the free market issues, and our allies are the G20 and the US. I think you could possibly feel free to comment on our support for Hamas.
And I think I ask.
So you're going to rule me out of order?
Are you going to ask? Yeah, I'm ruling out of order.
No, he has mentioned Hamas, and obviously we have diplomatic relations. We're supporting Hamas. The G20, the European, everybody else are against Hamas. So it's a free market issue, actually.
Yeah, look, I think it's slightly outside of my circle of competence, but my reading of the ANC's support for Hamas is, again, some of those ideological issues. They see themselves as a champion of the anti-colonial movement. They see the situation in Israel-Palestine as sort of a kind of neo-colonial conflict. And there's those historical allegiances as well that go back to the liberation struggle years in exile. Again, I sort of feel like it's a bit beyond my scope, but I do think there is a shifting in the global order in the world, and there is, I think the old system is under severe strain, and I think we've seen that since basically the beginning of the global financial crisis, Brexit, Trump. I think those are symptoms of that change, and the rise of the BRICS nations and so on. I would see that as part of a broader global realignment that's happening, and a new polarity. We often hear about the multipolar world, but I think most politics is actually bipolar, and aggregates around a specific political axis. I think in the 19th, 20th century, it was around material issues, but now we're seeing maybe more other ideological issues coming to the fore.
Thank you, David. David, I wanted to just explore this, ask you to comment on this cooperation of government and business in this country. Are we on some kind of a spectrum where you've got that old-fashioned word fascism on the one end and a whole gradient of other varieties before we get to that point of fascism or public-private collaborations?
Well, if we had to pick an ism, I would probably say it is corporatism, which we often hear this idea of a social compact. And I think that's also a very insidious idea. It assumes that everybody must be part of some kind of unified collective. And if you're dissenting against that, then that's very problematic. So I think the corporatism, what does that mean? That coalition of interests between big business, organized labor, and government. And on its face, you would think that big business and government and labor actually have very divergent interests. But often, big established businesses use their incumbency advantage to lobby for regulatory protection and to lock competitors out of markets. The RET faction, now MK, they would talk about white monopoly capital. But, I mean, we do have monopoly capital in many respects in South Africa. I would want to see much more free enterprise, reducing regulatory barriers to entry to allow more people to compete. If you're a successful business, that doesn't mean that you should be punished for your success. But how did you achieve your success? Did you achieve your success by lobbying the government for special protection? Or did you achieve it through a value offering to the market that generated revenue for yourself? So I think in South Africa, we have far too much trying to influence government, trying to extract special advantages, and that's where things get very messy, like with the cadre deployment conversation we were having earlier. There's also big emphasis on inequality in South Africa, and obviously there are big disparities. I think South Africa's more urgent problem is a poverty problem, not necessarily an inequality problem. And as Friedrich Hayek often noted, attempts at true equality always necessarily involves some kind of infringement on liberty. And therein lies the risk of a tilt towards totalitarianism. So collectivism, what Hayek warned against in The Road to Serfdom, which was one of my recommended books.
Which is there?
Collectivism is not exclusive to the left or the right. So the National Socialists in Germany, the Nazis, also saw themselves as custodians of the collective will, right? But on the left, the call was representing the interests of the proletariat, the communist vanguard, if you will, of the proletariat. So that collectivist mentality can get you down some pretty calamitous roads to serfdom, as Hayek said. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think we should guard against these calls for everybody to be in this broad church, that we're all part of this national collective and we must all put our shoulders to the wheel and let the government lead us in the direction, because the government hasn't done a very good job of leading us. And it's destroyed livelihoods, it's undermined private property rights, etc. So I think a much more fragmented approach would actually be better for South Africa. We have a balance of power. So that's why when there were discussions earlier around a government of national unity, that made me a little bit uneasy, because what comes out of that, it's kind of a dollars dishwater consensus. What we actually need is big, difficult trade-offs. We need people to say, like, we can't have a national airline, we must close it down. We must privatize energy in South Africa. Do we need a national broadcaster? I mean, in Argentina, President Milei has closed the national broadcaster like that, and I don't think anyone will notice its absence. And I think the lesson from Milei in Argentina is you have to move swiftly and confidently in reducing state expenditure. I mean, in Argentina, their inflation rate has been north of 200, 300% for the last few years. I mean, that absolutely destroys income and wealth. And who does it affect the worst? Poor people. Poor people are income dependent. The wealthy people have their wealth often in assets, and assets sometimes appreciate with inflation. So if you own a house, that the price of that house goes up and sort of matches inflation off. Whereas if you're just earning an income and you need to buy bread and milk at the end of the week, your ability to do so as a poor person is rapidly diminishing, and that breeds a lot of political resentment as well. So I think we can definitely take some lessons from Argentina and their experience with Peronism, which is similar to our national democratic revolution, and aggressively reduce the size and scope of government and reduce state expenditure, and the money, the global capital will flow into this country and unlock amazing amounts of opportunity if we did that.
It's a really interesting experiment that's going on in Argentina right now. How far are we in this country away from getting to the point where they got to, where they said, no, damn it, we've got to change it, so let's bring a Javier Milei in?
Yeah, and I don't think an ordinary Argentinian is going to bed at night reading Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and thinking now's the time for libertarian policy options. But they are experiencing in their back pocket every time they go to the store the consequences of statist economic policies. So I think what Milei did was really tap into that resentment, that frustration at the ruling political class, and say we're going to do something totally different. And I think that galvanized people and made them support him. I mean, interestingly enough, he's also sidestepping a lot of embedded political interests within the country. The political class still dominates the legislature, but he's often doing it through executive decree. So it's much more successful than Macri, who was the previous reformist president, who said that he would, I think the metaphor he used, he said he would write to the legislature asking for a chicken, and what he'd get in return is a feather. So he tried to tread cautiously, tried to introduce through a gradual approach, this is Macri, the reforms that Argentina needed, but it was too slow, and ultimately he was, he lost against the Peronists at the next election.
Well, that talks to your point about do it, just get on with it. But my question really was, how far away is South Africa from the position that Argentina reached? Our inflation's 5-6%. There's 200. So how many years might it take for us of a statist government or more socialist government to get there?
Well, I studied comparative politics, and one thing I learned from that was that it's very difficult to compare different political and economic systems. They're highly complex. So many people would say, okay, well, the South African Reserve Bank is a bulwark against runaway inflation like that. I mean, we've seen that in Turkey as well with Erdogan and his politicization of the central bank there. And I would applaud the efforts of the current Reserve Bank governor to push back against some of the political threats to the bank's independence. But how long can he hold on? We've seen many institutions in South Africa actively captured by the political elite. And maybe Minister Enoch Godongwana has exercised some restraint in terms of not opening the spending taps. But his deputy, David Masondo, he has some other ideas, some fanciful ideas around modern monetary theory that you can just print your way out of these problems, and that you inflate away the debt, you monetize the debt. Oh, I think that's a road to ruin. So we should do everything in our power to avoid that.
And Masondo is much loved by big business. What a note to close on. David Ansara, thank you.
Thank you very much.